Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to the webinar on education for responsible consumption and sustainable lifestyle, a driver for SDG12 with Dr. Mirian Vilela. I now would like to introduce you to Juan Carlos Sainz Borgo, the Dean of the University for Peace, to give a little introduction.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again in this space as part of the United Nations Academic Impact Program of the SDG Hubs. As you well know, UPeace is the SDG Hub for the SDG 12, and we inaugurate this series of talks about the SDG 12 from different perspectives, especially from the educational point of view. Today, we are honored to have with us Professor Mirian Vilela. She is the Executive Director of the Earth Charter International Secretariat at the Earth Charter Center on Education for Sustainable Development. She is the coordinator of the UNESCO Chair on Education for Sustainable Development with the Earth Charter. She holds a doctorate in education from La Salle University, a master in public administration from Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and she has a bachelor with a focus on international trade. She has worked with the Earth Charter International Initiatives and the beginning in 1996. So therefore, she has been for 20 years working in the process of the Earth Charter. She's a permanent professor at the University for Peace, and she's a very close friend of the initiative of the university. So for us, it's a great pleasure to have you. And Miriam, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dean Juan Carlos and Gabby and the University for Peace for organizing this. I'm very happy to join you here. And I would like to start with a story. Not long ago, the thing that brings us together has to do with education for responsible consumption and sustainable lifestyle. So I just wanted to start with a story that happened to me not long ago. I was visiting a friend, and when I came to her house, she gave me a little bag with a few things inside, and she said, "Well, this is our gift for you." And she gave me a box of a shampoo. And for me, it was quite striking because in my psyche, when I think of a shampoo, I think of a plastic bottle that I have to use to wash my head. And then after the shampoo, you use the conditioner and you have another plastic bottle. So for myself, was quite striking that I had to open a carton paper, open it and look at shampoo that looks like a soap. So it was for me, and similarly to the conditioner, hair conditioning. So for me, it was the first time in my life that I was looking at a shampoo through this new lens, and that looks like a soap, right? It doesn't feel easy to fit at first, but it requires some time for me to take a new look at the way in which shampoo could look like. So this for me is just a way to illustrate changes that are happening, but changes that also require us to look at our own assumptions and worldviews regarding how things are supposed to be. So the whole idea of sustainable consumption or something related to that, there are different ways of calling it, sustainable lifestyle, responsible consumptions. A few people and group in Brazil decided to move away from the wording or the concept of sustainable consumption and rather call it responsible consumption for obvious reasons. Depends on how we connect with these words. But what I wanted to start by sharing is that what is written in SDG 12 regarding sustainable production and consumption, it's not really new for the UN. Some of it was already written in the 92 agenda that emerged out of Agenda 21. It was actually written in the Brundtland Commission report that back in 1987 already identified that one of the biggest world challenges had to do with the unsustainable patterns of our production and the unsustainable patterns of our consumption systems. So back in 1987, the Brundtland Commission already identified these two as one of the big world challenges that needed to be addressed. And therefore, these similar notions were part of what was called the Agenda 21 that emerged out of the Rio 92 Earth Summit, was kind of the SDG of the 1992 Earth Summit. Therefore, it was the outcome of that. Right? Want to say is that this whole notion of the importance to take a look at our consumption and production pattern has been around for over 20, 30, and even more, 35 years, if we look at it from the Brundtland Commission report. But I think in terms of UN policy or policies, what has happened in the last 20 years is that has been strengthened. So before the SDG 12, in 10 years ago at the Rio Plus 20 that was held in Brazil in June 2012, an important UN document was launched that was called 10YFP, as it's referred, but it's the 10-year framework program for sustainable production and consumption, which was a 10-year plan that UN launched at Rio 92, but was also being negotiated, I think, almost 10 years earlier, since the Johannesburg summit in the year 2002. And what happened, so that 10-year 10YFP, the 10-year framework program on sustainable consumption and production, was led by UNEP, the UN Environment Program, in coordination and collaboration with different stakeholders and among other things, to develop a whole program on education for sustainable lifestyle. So I think what's happened is that since then, the SDG were launched in 2015, and with the important SDG 12 focusing on specifically on that. So there are different UN efforts and agenda that are kind of coming together on this. So, but just to come back with my initial example of my own experience in trying to look at shampoo and how I use shampoo with different eyes, and the whole effort that the UN is developing over the past 30 years in trying to articulate awareness and understanding on the importance to move away from our unsustainable patterns of production and consumption and move towards a more sustainable or responsible patterns of consumption and production. So there is a lot being done from an angle of policy making at the UN level, but also new understanding of how we can incorporate that into education. So from a UN point of view, there has been a lot of effort building not only on the SDG 12, but also on the 10-year framework program to invite governments to develop policies on sustainable or responsible consumption into education, bringing that or making particularly a governmental policy to incorporate sustainable consumption or responsible consumption or sustainable lifestyle into education. So for instance, not many governments have actually developed that policy, although that has been a call for that, and specifically this is an effort that UNEP has been undertaking. But I know the government of Brazil, for instance, did over less than 10 years ago create a policy on sustainable consumption and sustainable lifestyle, incorporating that into education. However, there's a huge gap, as you know, in terms of policy making and policy implementation. And a lot of this involves, I would say, education, awareness raising, sensitization. So let me briefly share with you a presentation that I put together for you today. So just to start sharing, Dean Juan Carlos mentioned about our UNESCO chair. It's a UNESCO chair precisely focused on education for sustainable development with Earth Charter. It's a chair that is co-hosted by the University for Peace and Earth Charter International and our education center that is located here on the campus of the University for Peace. But the work of research and training, it really lies at that intersection between sustainability, values, and the Earth Charter, and how to bring that to education. But to start, I would like to acknowledge that there is so much diversity and commonality in our human family, if we look at this through those lenses. But those lenses of global citizenship that goes beyond our national borders really require a new sense of care and responsibility for the common good and for planetary well-being. And of course, it lies with this whole notion of what's the impact of our consumption patterns in our lifestyles. I would like to start also by bringing to you the voice of Thomas Berry through this book called The Great Work. And he says, history is governed by those overarching moments or movements that give shape and meaning to life by relating the human venture to the large destinies of the universe. So I think the movements that we are currently living of paradigm shift of worldviews that involve either the Earth Charter movement, the Agenda 21, or the SDGs, and especially what brings us together today which is the SDG12, and new ways in which we can look at education, are part of these overarching movements that are shaping the way in which we relate to one another and the large living mode. So much of the work we do, and I think a lot a lot of efforts for us to address the challenge that SDG 12 brings us has to do with our worldviews and mental models. Just as I started by sharing my own worldview and mental models is how I relate to washing my head with a shampoo, washing my hair with a plastic bottle of shampoo. It's kind of an invitation for me to question my own assumptions that a good shampoo can also look like a soap. So I bring to you the Iceberg Model. That is something that Daniela Meadows created over 20 or 30 years ago, which is an instrument to serve as a guide for systemic thinking. So what does it mean is that we often spend a lot of time looking at the tip of the iceberg, which could be climate change or unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. However, the invitation here is for us to look at what is underneath the iceberg, things that we normally don't see or make visible. Therefore, what I bring to you today has a lot to do with the focus that lies on looking at our worldviews, our mental models, our assumptions, our values that actually are at the bottom of a lot of the icebergs that we see, which is the tip of icebergs around. So when we talk about assumptions and worldviews, I invite you to think that probably and predominantly the paradigm and the predominant paradigm in which we are currently living is very much focused on what we see on the left-hand side of our screen is focused on an anthropocentric or egocentric, centered on the well-being of human beings. Yes.
Are you sharing? Because I can't see.
Yeah, it has to do with what I was trying to do earlier, right? Thank you, Gabby. Okay.
Yes, now we can see.
But you could see the shampoo that looks like a soap.
Yes, that we could.
Okay, so let me share the image of the iceberg. So the iceberg model is just a metaphor that Donella Meadows created some years ago to invite us to consider when we are looking only at the tip of the iceberg and the need for us to look at what is underneath. And at the bottom of the iceberg lies our mental models, assumptions, worldviews, values, and beliefs, such as the one that I mentioned of my own assumption regarding how I should wash my hair with a plastic bottle of shampoo that needs to be questioned, and I can actually shift my worldview or my assumption into, well, could actually make use of a shampoo that looks like a soap. Anyway, it's just an example to illustrate this need of shifting our mindsets and question our own assumptions. So the iceberg model is just an instrument to help us think about what is underneath, what we see on the top or on the tip of the iceberg, and sometimes the need to look at and focus on our worldviews and mental models. And one example is this one that illustrates with this view, which is probably a predominant way in which we look at things, a predominantly way in which we address our challenges is through the lenses of our anthropocentric approach, because that's how we have been taught, that's how our society is organized, and that's how our worldviews and assumptions are cultivated, right? Through everything we see, from the news articles to the news, to the books, to the films or movies we watch, and etc. Probably mostly nurture a notion of a more anthropocentric approach to life than a more life-centric or ecocentric approach to life. And therefore, when we talk about sustainable consumption and production, through a very broad sense of sustainability, requires this challenge of questioning our worldviews and assumptions in why do we do things and how we make decisions. But very quickly, we're all aware of the 2030 agenda of the SDGs, but what brings us together here is maybe looking at SDG12 on responsible consumption and production, maybe as a driver for all the other SDGs, because if we want to address, for instance, SDG 6 or 7, which is on water and energy, it requires new ways of looking at responsible consumption. For instance, how we make use of the water, either for agriculture or for our own personal needs. How do we make use of water into the agricultural system or into the production of anything from our computers to our mobile phones, for everything, or mostly everything that we consume and wear and need, from even the vaccines we take there, and even during the COVID times, there was a lot of need, or there has been a lot of need of water, for instance, no? SDG 6 that relates to water. But how important it is to use SDG 12 to expand and raise awareness on the importance of responsible consumption of something such as water, or SDG 7 on something that has to do with energy and ensuring access of quality energy and clean energy for all, which involves SDG 7. But how much SDG 7 relies, I would say, on SDG 12. But also how much SDG 12 and SDG 4 are interrelated and can become key drivers for the whole 2030 agenda. There is a need to revisit the way in which we look at the role of education. So very quickly, SDG 12 talks about ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. As I mentioned before, a similar notion was already written in the Brundtland Commission report back in '87, also in the Agenda 21. And then in 2002, at the Johannesburg Summit, there was a lot of conversation around the importance to create new policy mechanisms to reinforce and stress the importance to look at that particular concept. And therefore, between 2002 and 2012, the 10-year framework program of the UN was developed. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then SDG 4 calls on us to ensure inclusive and ethical quality education and promote lifelong learning and opportunities for all. So I'm just sharing these two because they're quite related to one another. But specifically SDG 12 talks about a few things that are already going on, and they're going on not only because of the SDG agenda, but because a few efforts started a few years earlier, especially with the 10-year framework. So SDG 12.1 talks about the importance to implement the 10-year framework programs on sustainable consumption and production, which is an effort that UN Environment Program has been articulating and promoting. And a lot of it has to do with education for sustainable lifestyle, which again, we can call it education for responsible consumption or sustainable consumption. SDG 12.3, target 3, talks about the importance to halve the capital global food waste. So making visible what sometimes it's not so visible is the amount of waste we as a global society are generating increasingly more as the years go by. Then SDG 12.5 again talks about the importance to reduce waste generation through prevention, reduction, and recycling. But again, what I'm trying to say is that how to make that happen without a new approach to education at all levels, no? Formal, non-formal, and informal education. And when we talk about formal education, it's important for us to envision all levels of education, primary, secondary, and higher education. The importance to address each one of these, but for instance, 12.5, it's something that's very clear. When we look at the bottom of the iceberg that I mentioned before, what we could see, the reason why there's so much, for instance, food waste or waste being generated and so much lack of knowledge on how much our consumption patterns and lifestyles are impacting on the well-being of life on Earth. I think one thing that we would envision or could envision here is an issue of illiteracy. That although the world has more and more an increasingly bigger population having access to education and having access to higher education even, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have more literacy in terms of ecology and how we could link the way in which we could see the responsibility and impact we have in the large living world. So we could see a vacuum in the ecological literacy of the well-educated people we have around the world. So this is just something that I invite you to think about. So there could be a few other things to mention about SDG 12, but one is 12.7 that involves promote public procurement practices. I would like just to flag that there are a number of countries developing policies on that. Certainly Costa Rica and Brazil, which are the countries I know the best to share, the governments, especially led by either the Ministry of Environment, or in the case of Brazil, actually the National Association of Lawyers have been developing policies and agendas on public procurement practices that ensure that the notion of sustainable consumption and production, especially on the procurement side, is embedded in the decisions at the public level. When there is purchase being done at the public level, now more and more, many countries are developing policies that ensure accordance of these principles in national procurement or public procurement. And I think that's quite interesting that this is emerging over the past 15 years. Ensure that people everywhere have the relevant information and awareness on sustainable development and lifestyle. So SDG 12.8, of course, requires an important decision to reorient how we can incorporate these notions into education, but also in different ways in which decisions are made. So for instance, a number of significant efforts have been developed for instance, in looking at the life cycle of products. And sometimes it's even embedded in policies at the OECD to require that. So what I'm sharing here is just an example of an initiative to promote sustainable procurement through a pledge, again, to promote an awareness and understanding on what does it mean, sustainable procurement, how to make that happen, why does that exist, and how that effort is related to SDG 12. So this is, again, just one example of an effort that is happening at the global level, but also in many different countries, and I would say institutions also that are aligning with the SDGs. So at the different levels, at the global level, national level, and institutional levels, policies have been developed to ensure sustainable procurement that are aligned with this notion. And all of this involves, of course, education. So now my wish is to link SDG 12. Let's look at the time here. SDG 12 with SDG 4. Because SDG 4 has a very particular target that links to SDG 12, that is ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge, skills, we could say values, that are needed to promote sustainable development. So what I invite you to think is, what are those knowledges? What is that? What is the kind of knowledge and skills or even values that could promote or cultivate a more sustainable global society? And then the UN articulates these terms, let's say, education for sustainable development. So these ensure that all learners acquire knowledge needed to promote sustainable development through education for sustainable development, education for sustainable lifestyles that is linked to SDG 12, and then it goes on, education for human rights, gender, etc., education for global citizenship. The beauty and the problem that I find in these words and terms and UN policies is that there are a lot of efforts being done in all of these, but to a certain extent, they are fragmented and parallel rather than looking at them under a common umbrella of education for change that are linked to all of these. And by the way, there is a whole effort into the climate change world, the climate change negotiation, because of the UN framework for climate change has an Article 6, and the Paris Agreement has another article, Article 12. Both are stressing and emphasizing the importance of education for climate change. The point that I'm trying to highlight here is that education for sustainable development, education for sustainable lifestyle, for sustainable consumption or responsible consumption, or even education for climate change and global citizenship, they are all relatively similar. There is a lot of synergies among all of them, and it's important for us to acknowledge and recognize those synergies and differences. rather than generate different projects or efforts that are too fragmented and not necessarily easy to connect. One of the reasons why I mentioned this is that when we go to the very local level of implementation, let's say a primary school teacher or a school that develops a project on one of these terms, it would make much easier to develop curriculum or activities that see the connections among all these different UN education agendas and efforts, rather than see them as separate or different. So when it comes to concepts and values, I think that's one way in which these different UN agendas on education for sustainable lifestyle, consumption, and education for sustainability, that we find a common ground, which are similar values and to a certain extent, knowledge and even skills that needs to be embedded and cultivated in our education systems, again, formal and non-formal education. But the question that we should often ask ourselves is, what are the values that are underlined or embedded or taught in processes of teaching and learning? Because if we look at the world population 100 years ago and the world population of nowadays, we have a much bigger percentage of world population that has access to education. However, having access to education doesn't mean that we have more educated people that are more sensitive and conscious of these issues that we are currently trying to address, such as sustainable consumption, climate change, or sustainability. So it's very important that as we look at the role of education and the purpose of education and how education is being undertaken, that we look at our worldviews and the values that we want to cultivate in order to reorient our civilization towards a more caring and responsible civilization, responsible and caring for the common good. I'm just going to almost done. I'm almost there. Let me just bring this metaphor of our footprints, because our consumption patterns and our lifestyles are linked to the footprints we are leaving on our path here. And depending on how aware we are and how our conscious are, we can live or be aware or conscious of the different kinds of footprints we are able to leave here in different spheres of action we have in our world. So over many years, we have been trying to generate consciousness with regards to our ecological footprint and the size of footprint we are leaving, and the fact that our footprint should not go beyond the Earth's biocapacity or the Earth's regenerative capacity, the capacity of Earth to regenerate itself. So currently, our footprint in terms of the size of footprint we are generating through our lifestyles, predominantly it's bigger than Earth's biocapacity, or the capacity of Earth to give all the natural resources that we need to produce all the products that we need every day. So our current predominant footprint is bigger than the Earth's biocapacity, and we need to amplify our vision on the importance to understand or envision a new aspiration to consider what is regenerative footprint. What does that mean? It means that we are walking through here, and through our decisions, we have embedded the importance of not only minimizing the negative impact that we are generating as we make decisions, and the negative impact that we have through our consumption lifestyles, but in having a positive impact, an impact that could thrive that Earth, or an impact that envision that our decisions and lifestyles would contribute to a more flourishing and regenerative Earth. So I think this is a key instrument, or a key educational instrument for us to envision in terms of how we ought to look at the impact that we are generating as consumers, but also for those who are in the process, in positions of production systems, that we need to embed this notion of the kind of footprints and impact that we are generating here. So with this, I just wanted to leave here with this notion of how much our education experiences, be it in primary school, secondary school, higher education, or non-formal or even informal education contexts, is helping us to understand even Earth biocapacity, understand the importance to reorient our consumption and production patterns in a way that it doesn't go beyond Earth's regenerative capacity, and how much our education experience is helping us to amplify this notion of regeneration, walking through this Earth, through our lives and decisions, in a way in which we are committed to make decisions that will contribute to the regeneration of Earth and contribute to a more flourishing Earth. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mirian, for your presentation. Before we started, you remember me what I did when I was studying biology in the university. With my, I did a education, environmental education plan for kids, for school kids. And I decided to do it focused in this target with little kids, 6-year-old kids, because when you mentioned the iceberg, what's on the lower level under the water, I think that the problem starts on what are we teaching the children. They repeat everything we do. They admire their parents and the big people that surrounds them. So everything we do, they will try to do the same because they think that is correct, and it's not always the case. So that's why I decided to go on this target to start trying to solve the problem with the little ones, so that then when they grow up, they have different values and can repeat the same with when they have kids. And so when you were saying that the formal and informal education, I think you're right. We have to go to this point, because one thing I realized when I did this project is that, well, at least at that time, I don't know if it changed now, but the program of the school, of the whole year, it only mentioned one objective in that subject, in environment or biology, or for the whole year, only one objective. So that really shocked me, because it's more than just one objective, not something that we can take that in the very light way. So I think it's also very important to go to try and talk this subject more with these higher institutions that
yeah, Gabby, the thing is that we are bombarded by everything we see through movies, through advertisements, to connect a good life with a material life. So it's explicit and implicit in many things we see around us, from the news to a movie, and of course to many advertisements. It's very explicit, the notion to make to create a worldview that connects a good life with a material life, a successful life with the more I have, with quantity rather than quality. So if we don't have the capacity to question our own assumptions and worldviews, it's going to be very hard to make this shift towards the SDG on sustainable consumption. So anyway, education, critical thinking, system thinking, values education is it's of utmost importance for us.
Yes, and another thing about the shampoo. I saw last week a news from UK that they are outside the supermarkets. They have these things where you can go and refill bottles of shampoo.
Yeah.
So I think that we are moving slowly, but we are trying to do a little change.
Yeah, and for that kind of change to happen, I think a lot of different things need to take place. No, one is policies, national, international policies that kind of stress or highlight the importance to change the production patterns and even the products, but also education that reaches the producers and also the consumers, to the consumers to be demanding for new kinds of products or products that shows, for instance, more information on the environment and social impact of the products that are currently being produced.
Yes. Well, thank you again, Mirian, for your time and touching this very interesting subject. Juan Carlos, do you want to say a few closing words? No? Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you in another webinar. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Many thanks. Obrigado. Gracias.
Bye.